Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce the inaugural Ryan Institute of Complexity speaker, Dean Julio Ortino. In many ways, he is the perfect person to start us off for all the things he has done for complexity science writ large and complexity science here at Northwestern. But more on that a little bit later, because I see some new faces in the room, and I just wanted to give you a little bit on Julio. When I think of Julio, there's like three words that come to mind for me. One is thought leader, two is innovator, and three is crusader. If you take a look at his record, I could go on and on and on, but there are some things that he has distinctions on that all of us would love to have and aspire to, but very few people actually do. He's got, 12 covers of Nature and Science. He just did the Michelson lectures. He's been to Davos. He's won so many prizes. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and also a Guggenheim Fellow, all related to his work on dynamics, fluids, complexity theory, mixing processes, and that's all in the hard sciences. But he also does a lot of work on the mixing of the human brain. He's quite famous for his thinking about right and left brain thinking and actually whole brain thinking, how you mix those two things together. He created a tremendous number of innovations at the engineering school when he was dean there. In fact, he doubled the footprint almost, he put up a new building, did many extensions, hired world-class faculty, improved the demographics of the students going there, and has had a long-lasting impact on engineering and actually all of Northwestern with his visionary thinking. He's perfect for this inaugural presentation because he really started complexity theory at Northwestern, and it really is entirely up to him. I think it was probably around 2004. He decided to put a luncheon together at the Allen Center, which is no longer there, and he invited anybody who was interested in talking about complexity theory. I showed up because it had an interesting name, and we all got completely engrossed in his vision of how complexity theory could really change the way people do science in physical, social, and humanities. And that humble beginning eventually led to NICO being founded. NICO's founding also helped with the founding of the Ryan Institute. And Julio's spouse, Alicia Loeffler, has had a lot to do with also expanding Northwestern's research on innovation with DASHUN in particular. He's done so much since then, and it's really hard to characterize how I would describe him today, but I think public intellectual is what I think makes the most sense. His most recent book on the Nexus is really an absolute joy to watch and read. And it's full of so many creative thoughts and really inspiring. And it really puts together his idea of mixing the right and the left-hand brains. If you haven't had a chance to get it, I really suggest you take a look at it. It's been a great bestseller on Amazon, and it's been reviewed so well in so many places. With that, I'd like to welcome people who are here. For everything. Wow, that's I don't know those kinds of things. The sections of help.
But I'm really glad to be here. I want to thank DASHUN, Brian.
Yes, for being very honest.
And I'm really interested in what's going to happen with this institute. So I hope that some of the things that I will say here kind of resonate with you. Some things probably are known to all of you. A few things may not be. But if I have, I'm writing another book with actually someone who used to be here at Kellogg, Daniel Diermeier, who, after living here, became provost in Chicago. He's actually the boss of our current president in here, because he was the dean of the law school in there, and now he's the chancellor in Vanderbilt. Now, if I had finished this book the talk will be much better and more compact, but what I'm going to give you is an idea about, there will be some things that probably will end up in the cutting floor on the thought process in writing the book. The book is some concepts and ideas being developed, and there will be some ideas about leadership at the beginning and the end, and a whole bunch of things having to do with creativity. But as I said, I will give you some of the thinking that has gone into the book. And if the book was done, I'm sure the talk will be much better, more compact. So let me start with something that to motivate the discussion. The concept of VUCA, developed by the War Army College, is still resonating with people. In fact, and there's an article there, 2023 in Harvard Business Review, and some consulting companies are using this. And it kind of describes the world how it was in 1980, brittle, anxious, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And then after that came another one, which is called Bunny. But fine, they seem to describe the world and more how our emotional content, but doesn't really prepare our minds to go and solve the issues that we're facing today. And the issues that we're facing today, just to, I mean, you can give an entire talk about classes of problems, but I'm borrowing here from Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher. He talked about clock problems and cloud problems. Clock problems are problems that have lots of parts, complex they may be, but you can solve them once and for all. Cloud problems are amorphous, changeable. You can solve it only temporarily. You cannot solve congestion in Chicago forever. You can solve it only for a while. The problem is that when we use clock reasoning to solve cloud problems, and the clock reasoning comes from the amazing influence that Newtonian thinking has had in our lives. I dare to say that it's much more than what most people here will think Newtonian influence has been, okay? It was a world characterized by perfect determinism, complete predictability, and direct causality. Every effect had a clear, identifiable cause. Now, the world now, and you can write your own description or ask AI to write it for you, is far more complex. It's more interconnected, probabilistic, is far less predictable. Sometimes you touch one thing in one part of the system, you do not know where that. So that's a world that we're living today. And the question is our thinking prepared for this new world? And my view is no. Well, my view and Daniel Diermeier's is no. And why not? Because of the amazing success that this Newtonian picture has had on us. And the Newtonian picture, if you want to start with a beginning, is the amazing, influential book that Newton wrote when he was forced out of Cambridge because the plague came. And he wrote this book that contains the 3 laws that explain the functioning of much of the world. And it's amazing, the book, for what it has, but what it does not have. Because Newton actually spent a lot of time on alchemy, biblical interpretation of events, a whole bunch of things. And he didn't put any of that in Principia. Principia was something perfect. And that perfection is what really influenced the world today. He had critics. He also had people who really promoted him. Voltaire was a famous philosopher in France, but not famous enough that he would avoid being thrown in the Bastille because of a duel with some aristocratic member of the French family there. Believe it or not, he was for 1 year in prison, no windows in the Bastille, and he negotiated, I kid you not, that as an alternative punishment, wouldn't the French government send him to England? Okay? He went to England, fell in love with Newton, wrote books about Newton's letters to the English. Not only that, when he came back, his mistress, Madame de Châtelet, is the one who translated Principia into French. She even added parts that Principia didn't have, like kinetic energy. So he promoted him completely. Not only that, he completely denigrated everything that Leibniz was doing, to the point that he even criticized him. Leibniz was, of course, who co-invented calculus with Newton. He even wrote a play, Candide, that criticized Leibniz for his unreasonable optimism. Okay, so Newton was there, and the whole thing conquered all continental Europe. There were problems. One problem appeared out of the most amazing success of Newtonian mechanics, which was discovering a new planet with pencil and paper. So Uranus was not behaving exactly as predicted by Newtonian theory, but they couldn't believe that Newtonian theory was wrong. So lots of possibilities were presented, but one that won the day was there has to be an unknown cause, an unknown planet producing these deviations, and if we find it, everything will balance out. And lo and behold, John Harriot in England and John Couch-Adams in France, Couch-Adams kind of won the race, decided that a new planet will appear, and if you point a telescope in this specific direction in the sky, the new planet will appear. And voila, the new planet Neptune appeared. But there was a problem. The problem was that still at that point, you could predict 2 planets. You could not predict 3. So a race started, lots of money was put by the king of Sweden, who could solve for the first time the 3-body problem. And out of that, Jules Henry Poincaré won the race and basically showed that this couldn't be done, and that the source of the problem, embedded in the bowels of Newtonian mechanics, was chaos. And this was not really represented well. In fact, Poincaré's obituary, when he died, they barely mentioned this, that chaos was the first problem, that the challenge to determinism that was there. So the amazing reach of Newtonian mechanics is that affected more than physics, affected philosophy, Locke, Hume, Voltaire, affected economics with Adam Smith, affected the concept of God. Is God the perfect machine? Or is the universe so perfect that God can step aside? And where do we see? Lots of issues with free will, determinism, affected government. All the founding fathers were Newtonians. Thomas Jefferson even bought one of Newton's death masks. You see checks and balances with James Madison in the Federalist Papers. And you see this produced all the age of enlightenment, the age of reason. And you can, if you want to write a book, and you will have to have more than 20/20 vision to see this, you have to place this in a big, big canvas. And the big canvas is one canvas that has a timeline of science, a timeline of technology, a timeline of education, and this is the timeline, okay? So no one can read this, but I'm going to focus on one part that is the Enlightenment in there, and then in there is the Newtonian discovery, base discovery of Neptune, okay? But in there you have it, bigger, okay? You have the many successes of Newtonian mechanics in here, the discovery of Neptune. Maxwell comes in here, Poincaré reveals chaos. As you can see, it's 1889. Planck with quantum mechanics was to follow very soon. You can see all of this. The miracle year of physics, the year in which Einstein wrote the paper on photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, and relativity is in there. So you can see that. And by the way, when Einstein was asked on whose shoulders he stood, because Newton is reputed to say, I stood on the shoulders of giants. When Einstein was asked on what shoulders he stood, he said Maxwell. And Maxwell died the same year as Einstein was born. But I'm going to start earlier. I'm going to start much earlier because Newton was lucky. Some people prepared the ground for him. And the guy who prepared the ground was Galileo, who, by the way, happened to die the same year that Newton was born, okay? Galileo was regarded as the foremost natural philosopher of his time. And he was visited by a fellow named Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher who was in the third tour, maybe fourth. Hobbes got to leave England for several reasons. Maybe he left after this again. And Hobbes visited Galileo when Galileo was under house arrest. Galileo happened to die 4 years after the meeting. And Hobbes was, by the way, Galileo was under house arrest because of problems with the church. He got a little bit too clever with explaining. He wrote a book called The Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems. And it was a dialogue in between one person who knew everything and one person who was not very smart, called Simplicio. And Simplicio represented the church, and the church had enough with this. And he was under house arrest, but not living under bad conditions. He had an observatory and everything. So what Hobbes was fascinated was with Galileo's law of inertia. And this was a big deal because Galileo's law of inertia is basically Newton's first law. It said that if an object is moving, unless as a force interrupts it, it will continue moving forever, okay? Or if the object is at rest, it will continue at rest. Now, Aristotle's views was that if there is an object moving, like an arrow, there has to be a force influencing the movement. And Galileo said, no, there will be forces. One is air resistance. He didn't mention like that. But what Hobbes drew was an analogy of what would happen with humans and objects if humans were able to be subject to no forces whatsoever. And that became his first law. And then he came with another law, amazingly enough, 3 laws, about how to avoid collisions in between these humans. And with these 3 laws, he deduced, it's not like Thomas More coming with the idea of utopia and somehow saying this is it, or Bacon with Atlantis. He deduced the best form of government, and was the Leviathan, who was like a king. Now, kings were not happy with Hobbes because they didn't want their power to be deduced by someone. Power came from God. And so maybe Hobbes got to live again in England. But the Leviathan was 3 laws where he was trying to find the root cause of something, in this case, how society could be governed. Now, the Newtonian influence, of course, lives through Taylorism, but the way that hierarchical organizations are structured, standardized procedures, they believe that outcomes can be predicted with the RAM. It's all Newtonian. We can see it now. The Constitution, the checks on between powers, the Constitution of many countries are Newtonian influence in clearly, okay? So this is how, just to place things in context, because we are seeing how some technologies will disrupt things, AI. I don't think AI can match ever the influence that Newtonian thinking had in the way that influenced everything, from economics to theology to government, okay? So in there you have at the top Principia, and what I'm going to do now, you can probably, is go through revolutions, because there were lots of revolutions after Newton. Relativity, quantum, whatever, but they did not really change much the way that we think. And so I'm going to kind of describe at very high altitude these revolutions. And this one that, I don't know if you can read this, I'm not going to mention this much. It was the first revolution after Newton, was the birth of modern chemistry. These guys don't get much credit because physics sucks all the air in prestige affecting humanity. But after all, they were the people who proved mass conservation. And not that that helped Lavoisier, who was guillotined by the French Revolution after proving this. But if you really look at things from very high altitude, the chemistry, because there was an emphasis in measurement, precision, that kind of thing, is that everything that you see now in this room is the combination of very few elements from everything. Before the periodic table. So if I have the relationship between components matter more than the components themselves. That will be like the biggest lesson from the chemistry side. So you have the revolutions. I mean, here, I mean, start with statistical mechanics. Statistical mechanics is one big philosophical issue with Newtonian mechanics. How is everything, according to Newton, is reversible, how things are irreversible in macroscopic things. So you have this coexistence of microstates with macrostates. The microstates are probabilistic, okay? Entropy comes from here, predictable at the macrostate, predicting systems with many, many parts. We couldn't predict 3 particles. How can we predict 1 million? And statistical mechanics put probability in the picture and did that. Then you have the amazing consequence of changing your frame of reference, relativity, how things change completely. Then quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, probability not as a fix, but as an integral part of how the world works. And also the fact that there are things that are one thing, but we are limited in our ability to see them. When we explore them, we can see one thing or another one. Light being a wave and particle. Then we have, and I wanted Daniel to include this, it's not a revolution because it didn't fight something that existed. This came out of nowhere from von Neumann. Well, you can find precedents. Von Neumann in 1940. But we wanted to have something that addressed the consequences of rational thinking. And the consequence of rational thinking with game theory is rational minds pursuing rational goals can produce irrational results, okay? And forces us to abandon the assumption of the pure power of rational thinking to solve all problems. Then we have evolution. Evolution, the first scientific revolution with no laws, is a narrative. Now, the narrative of evolution, selection, mutation, recombination, fitness, evaluation, you can transport that and use that to improve algorithms, for example. It has applications way beyond biology. Then we have the amazing simplicity at the core of all biology, the DNA sort of replication mechanism, and then the amazing diversity that you get from a 4-letter code. And then we have something, the dawn of the script, which is a conference of technology, engineering, math, logic, the birth of computer science, the birth of everything that we have. And in here, I said the conference of engineering, math, logic, and technology has given rise to computer science. Now, in all of these things, this is what I had at the summary. I mean, I had the last summary. In all of them, I had a very brief summary of the science. In all of them, I had something for me, and this enters in the category of the scratch paper. Like, for example, in computation, created a framework where physical systems can be understood as information processes, blurring the line between abstract math and physical reality. For each of them, I will have something like this for me when I was writing this process. But then I'm putting them to the side, and now I'm looking at this from a high altitude, and we have all of those in blue. They are all connected from physics. They all emerge as challenges to the Newtonian foundations. And all of these originate outside physics. And I would argue that they are all connected with life and people, including computation. Because at the same time that Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, von Neumann was working on replicating algorithms. They are the same kind of ideas. So the question in here is, if I draw an envelope around all of this and try to extract the the essence of this, the essence from that I would communicate, Dashun, the world now is like this, or Dashun, you are running an organization, the organization that you run should be like this. How would this look like? Now, replace the Newtonian viewpoint? I'm not sure. The Newtonian viewpoint is still very useful. It has to be used for cloud problems, not for cloud problems. So it may be augmented. So what would happen if I put all of this, and this is what I come up. The organization of the future is one that embraces uncertainty at the micro level while maintaining a strategic direction at the macro level, one that accepts, synthesizes, and draws values on contradictory viewpoints, derives benefits from multiple perspectives, has the ability to evolve ideas. You can see where each of those sentences came from, okay? And creates conditions for emerging creativity and innovation. Except for that 5 words at the end, the rest come from the high level things of the revolutions themselves, which is completely aligned with how the world is today. Maybe this was all in the air. All that I have done is just put it together. Now, I could add more revolutions. Complex systems, chaos theory, network science. This is my brief summary. System bio and synthetic biology. System bio because it's understanding biology. Synthetic biology because it's engineering biology. There are 2 parts. Let's say that and they are all intersecting. And I could add more things in here, and I put cybernetics, AI. The time will come for AI. So let's say that I feed this. Where could I feed it? Let's say you feed it into your favorite AI thing. I can educate it, feed it, and I can come up with, I said, no more than 55 words. You can read any of them, but tomorrow's organization operates as a complex adaptive network where connections create value beyond individual parts. It balances exploration with exploitation, synchronization with autonomy, embraces perspective-dependent truth, establishes simple guiding principles, build error correction mechanisms. That comes from the DNA part. Okay? Cultivates diversity of thought, creating environments where creativity compounds upon itself while maintaining strategic coherence. I think that I was surprised on how good they were. You can have more of these. And you can pick your favorite thing here, but they're all kind of aligned in the same direction. So what I didn't do, initially, for each of the revolutions, I could have extracted the organizational component. For example, from modern chemistry, where I said the connections between components matter. More than some of the parts. So for each of them, I could have done this, but I didn't do it. I didn't guide it. I showed this is in the category of structure. So this is what we have with AI. And the question now that you can ask, and I'm making reference to this very briefly, is you can ask me, fine, the world is like this, the organizations are like this, how do you act in this world? And this has to do with, I mentioned leadership somewhere at the beginning. This is work that I'm still developing with Bruce Mao, who was my collaborator in the previous book that I wrote. And before we had VUCA, volatile, complex, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what we came up, Bruce and I, is everything that we have done, and he has done many more things than I have, because he worked with the governments of Denmark, Guatemala, and Saudi Arabia. We can dump everything that I have done in these 4 buckets. A bucket that has to do with inspiration, connectivity, optimism, and nimbleness. For each of them, I wrote something, which I'm not going to, I'm not going to bother you with this, except to say that, for example, in here there is nimble thought. We put, William Shakespeare said, nimble thought can jump both sea and land. And I said, beware of ideas that can work only on land. So if you have something like this in front of you and you're running an organization, probably can help you to believe that in the middle of the chaos, you can have opportunity to do something. At least anticipate that chaos is something that will always be with us. So now, the ideas from Newton were mesmerizing from a theoretical viewpoint, mesmerized the founding fathers, Taylor, organizations. But the value that was added to the Newtonian ideas is that there were tools to act on those concepts. So, for example, calculus was built that if you are a student or a physicist, he said, there are these three laws, we believe that that's how the world works. With these tools, calculus, you can derive more consequences, and they derive more consequences. You could also argue that almost the whole department, with exception of Noshir, contractor in industrial engineering or operation research firm, is all tools designed to advance a Newtonian viewpoint. Okay, that's good for problems that can be analyzed in that way. Now, the machine needs to expand and support what I would call post-Newtonian thinking. I would put complex systems, network science, AI. Statistics will appear in both sides, really, because there is a lot of algorithmic modeling that will fit in the second part. And the question with these tools is, do they represent an augmentation of thinking or create new thinking? Okay. I would say that if you internalize the lessons from complexity and you anticipate and respect emergence, and you are not surprised to see hidden connections that no one saw before, that represents a deviation from normal Newtonian thinking. I wouldn't say that this is popular across the board, at least it's popular with me and many people in this room, but it's not popular across the board. But I would say that complexity adds a new element to the thinking from the Newtonian. Now we have the AI revolution, and in 5 bullets, I try to explain what AI does, and I don't think nothing of this is controversial, okay? Like blur boundaries between human and machine capabilities in domains previously thought to require human judgment. And the question is, what influence this will have on thought? And in here I recall Winston Churchill when he vowed to rebuild the House of Commons that had been bombed by the Nazis. He said, we build buildings and then the buildings shape us. So we have these tools, and the question is, are these tools going to shape our thinking? We clearly can do many more things. I believe that there is such a thing as computational thinking. And why do I say this? Because I have had many conversations which I may have someone from biomedical engineering, someone from computer science. By the way, no one would argue that there is not such a thing as lawyers think different than economists, for example. There is a way of framing things almost instantly in thinking frameworks that we have, and computational thinking is there. And I do not know yet if we have something called AI thinking. That's still. Now, what AI can do now can lower the floor and raise the ceiling. So if you know nothing, it can help you, and if you know a lot, it can help you because you can ask many more questions. Now, the key issue is presupposes, in my view, that the user has some degree of understanding evaluating the quality of the answers. Okay, it's important. So I'm going to say a few things about creativity and AI. And let's agree on 2 things. Well, let's agree on the first thing. AI can access everything that has been done in a given domain, or everything, okay? And that for the moment, AI responds to questions, prompts. So let me start with somewhat unusual starting point. The starting point that I have is this, something called tensor. I don't know if any of you have heard about this. But tensegrity is an example of tensegrity. There are structures that are held together by things resisting compression, like steel tubes, connected by something like rubber bands. This has been with us for 120 years. A sculpture in Latvia did an exhibit where all the sculptures were examples of tensegrity. Just a picture. Now, the things defy a little bit of our imagination, but Mr. Fuller discovered this, by the way, and then this fellow, Sneldon, who worked with Fuller, that sculpture is in Washington, D.C., and it forces you to think, how on earth can this stay together? It looks like impossible, okay? But after hearing several presentations about this topic, first of all, people in material science can build materials that have properties that no material in nature has, metamaterials. And biology has seen this and discovered, now that we think about it, biology has been doing this. So then we have something that has been with us for longer. Origami has been with us for, 700 years. About maybe 70 years ago, one origami master codified the nature of faults. Some people in math discovered there's an interesting math in here. And one thing leads to another one, and you have a discipline now called origami engineering, where you could use origami ideas to deploy solar panel that you can transport in a rocket, and many, many applications. Why I'm showing you this? The reason that I'm showing you this is, by the way, the two things are coming together in terms of deploying robots that will expand and so on, is what kind of questions could possibly have produced those things as the answer? The question would not be, I want to know if origami has any connection with math. If you're asking that question, you already know the answer, okay? So this is part for a much longer talk, but the lesson in here is develop the lifelong habit of asking questions. And even though Picasso said this when computers were less advanced than now, he said this in 1968, it still is largely true. Computers are useless, they can only give you answers, okay? So far, they cannot help you with questions, okay? So what can AI do now? So we can ask questions like, can you explain this to me? You can get very good explanations about something, a phenomena that is not there explained. You decide if the explanation is good or not. You can ask, can you tell me what item I would be deployed in area 2 or area B? Lots of things. Combinatorial creativity is something that they are perfectly defined, useful for. New concepts can emerge. The other thing that you can do, you could ask, find every piece of science fiction written over the last 100 years, correlate them with scientific discoveries, and even with predictions by scientists themselves, see which one can predict the future better, science fiction writers or scientists themselves. Is amazing. On this is what, go and find every patent over the last 50 years, perfect, okay? But you have to ask the right kind of questions, okay? The other thing that it can do, it can fill holes. Now, you have to be realistic as to what holes can you fix. There are areas of math that have holes. They are called conjectures. And if you prove one of them, the Clay Institute will give you $1 million. Good luck having asked, can you prove Fermat's theorem now? Is it proof that the most failed proofs of anything was Fermat? So, or you cannot ask, we have a little problem stabilizing fusion. It could be great for future energy. Give me a design that works. Come on, okay? So you have to have a sense of it. So, but you can feel lots of things you can produce breakthroughs. A breakthrough is something that is so, it comes from the domain, but it's so important that it kind of pushes through the domain, breaks through the domain, and then the domain gets enlarged. And the breakthrough has been absorbed. But there is a higher level, and the higher level is what I would call a break with, which is transformational creativity. Okay? Transformational creativity is something that, for this idea to emerge, the idea cannot be based on ideas that weren't here before. One simple example is this. You're an architect, you have big commissions, you are designing spaces with big atriums like, I don't know, the Global Hub in here, and you said, give me ideas. It's 1960, and the question is, will you come up with what John Portman came in the early 70s? And John Portman, who, by the way, besides being an architect, he was also a developer, so he was not bound to satisfy anybody's vision. John Portman liberated elevators from the bowels of the building. Okay? Made it part of the design of the building itself. He put it used here in this view. And it was not anywhere in the set of any previous building. The other one that is, and there are several in here, is you can fit the entire content of Western art prior to 1900, where people like William Adolphe Bouguereau was at the top. He was regarded as the most famous painter in France. There are lots of pieces from this fellow in Milwaukee. And say, tell me what would happen in the next 10, 15 years. And I don't think you'll come up with Cubism or abstract expressionism or Fauvism or any of the things that happen after that. Why? Because all art was representational before that. Okay, so in the big diagram that I had a part in here in which I said algorithms start revealing solutions, and something here up to here, prediction drove understanding, or understanding drove prediction. Lots of things happening here, and you can see how many things happen at the same time. You have Claude Shannon, who is probably the most underrated person in terms of impact anywhere in at least in the US. All the theory of communications come from Claude Shannon. The Turing test, von Neumann, game theory here, Vannevar Bush, the endless frontier, the creation of NSF. The NSF, by the way, is probably the birth of modern research universities, is the birth of NSF. And comes from this guy who was the dean of engineering, but also the advisor to presidents. And also the Manhattan projects comes from him. And all of this happened here. The study of DNA and John Conway's Game of Life came a little bit after that. So you have all of these things piled up in there, and amazing technologies were created between, I would say, 1920, 1930, up to now. To the point that some people wonder about the effectiveness of math absorbing this knowledge in physics, chemistry, biology. So the miracle of appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulations of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. He was very poetic, but Eugene Wigner was Nobel Prize of Physics. He was a contemporary of von Neumann. Von Neumann never got a Nobel Prize, but he was far more famous than he was. So, but understanding allowed for prediction, okay? Now, you may understand something and not be able to predict things. You may understand how evolution works, even at a mechanistic molecular level, but you cannot predict, okay, by 2100, there will be something that will look like this. You cannot, so, but prediction, understanding allow for prediction. But now, prediction is becoming divorced from understanding, okay? So what AI can do now is you can extract value from data and recognize that the results, the big thing is the results really don't make sense to you because then you got something to explain. The results, surprising, maybe our task is to fill the gaps. You can ask whatever questions you want, you can assemble all the things, and you have to fill the gaps with your understanding of how things you think work, okay? So this is probably the most important slide. So in the Newtonian world, you are here. And in the post-Newtonian, you go there. So you go from certainty to probability, from determinism to emergence, from observing independence to context dependence, from linear causality to complex feedback systems. And my co-author, Bruce Mao, is very much into life-centered design, but human exceptionalism to continuity with nature, recognizing that we are not separate from, okay? So, but that would be the most synthetic summary of everything here. But if I have to pick one central idea from here, and this idea I presume will resonate with people here in the front row, is that we have to shift, we want to understand the world now, from understanding units to understanding units in context, okay? And that things can emerge from complex web of interactions. What name can you give to this? To be surroundedness, embeddedness, incorporation. The whole point is context matters. And that's a big difference with Newtonian thinking. It's probably the biggest difference. Now, it's not a new idea. I like this quote. A word is known by the company it keeps. That's how words get defined, by the company they keep. So I said this before, we build things and then they shape us, same with tools. So there were tools in the service of post-Newtonian viewpoints. I mentioned network science will be there, complexity, maybe agent-based models, everything connected with that. So will AI shape our thinking as well? Now, I think at some point we have to start recognizing that AI is many, many things. We speak as one thing, but it's many. So we have options. This goes back to the leadership part, my last slide. We have options. The world is in there. The first option is you're like a cork in water. You are driven by the currents. The other one is you really understand the system. You're a gamer. But I think what you need to do if you really want to function well is to be a game designer. Now, what things you need to learn to be a game designer? Again, if I have to extract only one, I would say embrace the lessons of complexity, and of those, master emergence. Okay? Emergence is something that is almost contradictory to how most things work now. You need to design the liberty, including the liberty to provide a fertile condition. I would say the function of a leader is to provide conditions for successful emergence. So, to be continued, maybe the book will put this more together in a more compact way, but thank you.
Julio, would you like to take some questions?
Absolutely. We are okay with time?
Yes.
Yeah.
So 10 minutes. Evie, go ahead.
I would really like to ask you about, could you speak more concretely about what kind of thinking and skills that we as academics really need to protect in order to embrace complexity, given that, all the AI tools are making everything more efficient on the surface, right? It's helping us write faster, read faster, code faster. But I feel like sometimes that's going a little bit against this idea of embracing complexity.
I will I mean, one thing that I couldn't do, my dream was to create one course, that would have all the tools of complex systems, network science, some nonlinear dynamics, agent-based. That will be optional. I thought the market will demonstrate that students will gravitate to this. But my advice would be, if I have to pick one thing, try to take courses that have to do with network science, but the course has to affect the way that you think. So, for example, there are famous tests that people have asked students in college who have taken physics, okay, have taken Newtonian mechanics, and then they ask questions like, I have a ball with a string, I move it like this, the string breaks, tell me what the ball will do. And it's as if Newtonian mechanics has had no effect, okay? So the important thing is to make the things a central part on how you think. But once you learn about failures, cascade networks, those kinds of things, reading the paper looks different to you than someone who gets surprised at things, because the world is much more interconnected now than it has ever been. So my advice would be, pray in the right place. Take courses on network science. Yeah.
Thanks, Julio. It's very, very inspiring to see you try to pull together the threads from all the different revolutions. That was really cool to see. I want to pick up on the last point about context matters. Is one way to interpret it that some of at least the hard sciences that you talked about are tilting or embracing some of the social sciences? So if you think about context matters, I think that's the heart of anthropology, some disciplines of sociology.
Okay, let me take the first one, because that one has a more concrete answer. I mentioned Hobbes drawing from Galileo, but statistical mechanics, Maxwell drew all the inspiration was from social sciences. There were people like Herschel, the one of the observatory, Quetelet. It was not called social science yet, but social physics, it was called, before Comte invented the word sociology. So the flux in between social sciences and hard sciences is not unidirectional, as people think, okay? But by context matters, I mean about the science. I mean that when you are looking at problems that are embedded in a network, we are tempted many times to examine things looking at the node itself and regard all the other things as part of the, how do you call it? The environment, what's the term? No, then we can. So we tend to isolate things and looking at the surroundings as something that we can blur and look at this part only. But for many things, the context, the surroundings matter, are essential to the answer. And you cannot just look at one part only. And I think that's a important thing. That politics and everything, you cannot touch one part in a system that is, ecology is full of examples like this, okay? You start killing seals because somehow the population of cod disappeared in the North Atlantic, and then you discover that you have screwed up everything. Oh, yeah. Or wolves in Yellowstone. Ecology is full of examples where you touch one piece and you cannot predict the consequences, that the cascade effects that they have. That's what I meant by context. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I'm trying to reconcile two things you said, one in the beginning, one at the end. At the end, you started to talk about leadership. And in the beginning, you were talking about these contradictions, exploration, exploitation, nonlinear outcomes, feedback
Yeah,
systems.
yeah.
And when I think about leadership today, none of those things seem to play any prominent role.
Which ones?
The complex way of thinking. Today, it seems like leadership in many ways is about the simplest of answers. I could solve the problem in a day. Give me an hour.
Yeah,
I alone can do these things. How do you reconcile something like that? If the ideas of complexity is so powerful, why is it that broader society doesn't embrace them? They embrace the opposite.
simplicity is mesmerizing.
Mhm.
But what I meant by exploration, exploitation, I mean, it could be that you are in, maybe it's an academic unit. The academic unit is sitting pretty at the top of the rankings because you have these people who are the best in the field and everybody recognizes this. But this will not last forever. So the question is, will you exploit that more forever, or would you explore some other things? But the same thing will apply to almost every industry. Nothing lasts forever in most industries. I mean, not all of them. If you're in the business of building planes, it's very hard to diversify and do something else. But many of them, at the one extreme, you have 3M or something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, people will take simplistic solutions, but doesn't mean that those things are the best decisions that you can make. So in many of them, the reason that I have exploration, exploitation, is things that may be contradictory, came from the part of quantum mechanics complementarity about reconciling opposites. And there are probably lots of examples where the ability to synthesize what seemingly are contradictory viewpoints is a skill that is very important now.
Can I ask you the concluding?
Well, actually, we do have the room for 15 more minutes,
Yeah.
so
Alright,
you
so-
might not have that last word.
All right, so I'll turn this into a comment.
You have a
then. All right.
question?
No, I just want everyone to know, we have the room for another 15
So,
minutes.
so the last slides about don't just write a current, try to be a gamer or a game designer, even better. And that's very resonating.
By the way, I should give credit for this. This came from Bruce and a guy from IBM when we were teaching a course in Dubai.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
And now I'm trying to think about the idea of driven by current. I think about like fluid dynamics. We know it's Bernoullian equation, but if the current goes too fast, it goes into turbulence, and then that becomes the Navier-Stokes equation, right? And then so that's where I was thinking about today's world. I feel these currents these days, there's overwhelming sense that these are like a tsunami.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of them. It's like we're
Yeah.
overwhelming
I mean,
sense that
that's a good analogy.
maybe this wave of AI really is a big deal. Maybe this administration has done something that reshaped the world out there within 100 days of taking office. So when we look at the world today, it feels like these are not currents. These are not little creeks that we can navigate.
No, so you can push your analogy. So if you are the flow is laminar, okay?
Right.
Little stream, you can move with it and adapt, but
Right.
at some point becomes more turbulent, and your ability to adapt
Right.
stops. Okay. What I meant by the Newtonian influence is that, to a large extent, we're still living in a Newtonian world. Even in political science, and you can probably give me on the right with this, Newtonian influence exists within some corners. So it's the ability to feel that you're living in an organized world where you can design things. I mean, the form of government, it was designed to move things kind of getting out of whack. That was the ideas of checks and balances. And as I said, this was what mesmerized people like my son, and the other ones. They were all members of what was called those natural revolutions. But now, if you want to really function well in the world of today, you need to move from that slide, deterministic to probabilistic, that linear to, you need to kind of change a little bit your frame of reference. And not everybody has to change it. Maybe survive in one location by moving with environment. But if you really are trying to do something significant, my view is you better kind of try to understand how the world is now. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the way you presented this shows kind of like this increase over time. Revolutions happen and revolutions build on each other. But there's something kind of like there's a straight shooting arrow of kind of history. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on kind of the continuity or the circular time aspect. Does circular time play a role in these kind of revolutions? And what I mean by that is there's balancing acts. Between different ideas. And it could be like a balancing act today where let's just destroy the scientific enterprise, so to speak. And then it comes back in some other way. I guess I'm curious to what degree like we have like repeating cycles within this larger like perspective that you're taking.
I don't know. We will take us to Nietzsche and people like that. I mean, the book that we're writing is full of history and giving shape to the characters because there are really interesting characters in there. I mean, it's supposed to compete with, I don't know, the Black Swan book or something like that. But we don't want to get into really philosophical aspects. So the answer is, I haven't thought about this, okay? Yeah. I know what some people have said about it, but I don't have my own view of this, okay? The surprising thing is that these revolutions were amazing. I mean, people are still, when they want to mention something amazing, they mention relativity. But relativity has not changed anybody's mind on how to think about the world, okay? Relativity appears in some things. GPS will work without relativity, but and we have the consequences of this. One thing that you see, and someone asked me about this, is when you take a broad view of history, is how our view is affected by things that they were, we talk about narratives. For example, Einstein never ever wrote E is equal mc squared. Okay, never. And I mentioned this to someone, maybe you. There's one, the fellow who is credited with not discovering entropy. Is the only tombstone, I think, in any cemetery that has an equation, and is Boltzmann, and has entropy S equals K log W. But Boltzmann never wrote that equation. It was Planck. So I mentioned this because what we remember about things are narratives constructed in time. But if you become like a historian, which I'm not, and you start digging more deeply, you find that things are always more complex than you thought. But I'm glad that you asked me the question, the flux in between social sciences and physics is fascinating because you think that everything will flow from physics to social sciences and econophysics, and no, it flew the other way before. Yeah.
Actually, on the theme that things can be more complex than we thought, and coming back to the kind of current game designer,
yeah,
which I really like. I mean, I sort of look at the world today and I could think of those, most people are caught up in the current. You're sort of paralyzed a little bit.
Yeah.
You're kind of passive. And then gamers in this context would be like becoming a big social media influencer or starting your own crypto firm with your own crypto token, or you're
Yeah,
kind of exploiting this new thing in some sort of entrepreneurial way. And then game designer would be like someone who's saying we need to work on gerrymandering rules, or we need to, in a policy sense, saying we need to get rid of maybe Section 230 shielding media platforms from liability or whatever other institutional fix you might throw on the table. But I feel like game designer is like super hard because even those things, it's not obvious what the effects are, and because things are more complex than that, they're often very complex. And so, like as a researcher, we can sit here and say, okay, well, here's what new games I might look like.
Yeah.
You know, and it makes some suggestions. But as a leader, this is really my question. As a leader of like an organization, how do you think about game designer? Because I think things are so complicated. It's not entirely clear. It'll never be entirely clear, but it can feel almost super non-obvious what design you would make. And so what, and the real time of which leaders make decisions.
I mentioned leadership at the beginning and at the end, and I'm still working with Bruce on this. But I think at the end, what matters is how do you think of yourself? Because if you think yourself as a potential game designer, that's probably very different in the way that you will approach questions that reach you than if you're just one of the guys who is moving with the current. So it's influencing the way that people think of themselves. The narrative that you create about yourself, I think is essential. But I think the three examples that you mentioned, they were perfect. And one good question would be to think at this moment in history, who are the game designers? You would like to think that our leaders would be some of those people. And Vannevar Bush, which I mentioned in the past, who became an advisor of Roosevelt, and then Truman, who basically was the designer of NSF with the elder. I would say he will be a very good example of a game designer.
So I think you've already touched on this, but we did get a question from Zoom and I wanted to see if you had anything additional to add. Can you comment about the difference in managing risks from a Newtonian versus a non-Newtonian perspective? It seems like a key difference at many levels.
Yeah, I need to think more about this, but I think the idea of probability is not really built into anything within the Newtonian framework. Okay? It kind of gets altered. I mean, the Newtonian framework, at the very essence of it, there are two ideas that are central. One is the idea of determinism, that if you know where you are, you will know where to go, okay? And that idea was challenged by chaos theory, in which tiny difference in here coupled. But then the idea of analyzing reductionism, that is a complex system with many parts. You can analyze the pieces one by one, and that's enough. But complexity tells you no, you have to analyze them as a whole. So the idea of probability in itself is not part of the Newtonian scenario. You can produce different scenarios that will say, if we do this, this may be the outcome. If you do this, this will be the outcome. But it's not something that generates Gaussians as possible scenarios, okay? I do not know enough about planning and things like that, and how people do things now. But at the very central point, there's no probability in Newtonian thinking. Yeah.
the beginning, you talked about the problem of applying clock tools to cloud problems. And how do you see that, or what are examples of that in the post-Newtonian? I wonder how that's, if you could apply that approach to the post-Newtonian framework.
Examples of products that fit.
That where you would see it as using clock tools on cloud problems.
Well, if you are running United Airlines and operation research is central to how you run things, okay? And for that, you have to use these tools kind of all derived from maybe Newtonian thinking. But if United Airlines was trying to change somehow the emphasis on how the company will run itself, because after 9/11, I thought naively that somehow regional airports were going to become more important because security will be easier to control. Okay, so let's say that something like that happens, and you decide what to do. I would say that that's more of a cloud problem, because you cannot even define. The objective function can be, yeah, you want the profit of United Airlines to be high, but it's not that clear. There are so many things in there that you could be changing. So I would say that will be one example.
Okay, thank you.